I'm former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And of course, this is a very interesting case, and those comments kind of overshadow a little bit of what's going on here. What do we make of the comments from both the Arizona DA and also Alvin Bragg in New York?
Well, Andy, thanks for having me as always. But Maricopa County Attorney Mitchell is wrong. And, there's a basis for extradition. And if the individual identified is the right person, and if the crime is a crime in both states and everything else works out procedurally, a state is supposed to extradite an individual to another state to stand trial. That's part of the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution. So if you're a prosecutor, you can't just choose not to extradite a murderer because you have an issue with how Alvin Bragg is handling an unrelated case, of course, that being the Stormy Daniels hush money case that's going to go to trial next month, in which Donald Trump is a defendant.
Yeah, and obviously they called it a slap in the face. Is there kind of a hierarchy? Because, of course, this individual was arrested in Arizona, and police were talking about how they potentially could commit even more crimes. Is there a hierarchy in terms of extradition, and maybe what comes the highest? Because obviously murder in New York feels pretty high.
Well, yeah, if someone is facing charges in a particular state, and Harvey Weinstein is an example, he or she is going to have to stand trial before they're extradited to another state. They may end up returning to finish their prison sentence. So that's a recent example between New York and California. It's usually, whoever files first. But of course, if something is significantly more serious, and there's nothing more serious than murder, then absolutely the individual should go stand charges for murder. And I think this is all political posturing, Andy. It doesn't really make any legal sense, because if it does, the Supreme Court's going to have to step in. And they have actually original jurisdiction when it comes to disputes between the states. So this case will be fast-tracked all the way to the Supreme Court, and Mitchell would lose, and lose pretty quickly.
All right, that's what was going to be my kind of next question, just because obviously you might have a different oversight. The Supreme Court is the oversight, and states generally work it out. But the Supreme Court is the next step. Can you kind of detail that a little bit more?
Well, that would be the next step. Whenever there's a dispute between the states, the Supreme Court has what we call original jurisdiction, not appellate jurisdiction. So, we've seen cases work their way up to the Supreme Court, either through the states or through the federal system. There's a trial court, an appellate court, sometimes there's a state Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court gets to choose whether they hear the cases. They don't have to take cases on appeal. Their jurisdiction is discretionary. But when it comes to cases of original jurisdiction, that means the cases start in the Supreme Court, and that's what would happen.
That is very, very interesting. And I also want to ask you a question, because yesterday during the press conference in Arizona, they were talking about the charges filed against al-Mansouri in Arizona after some stabbings at McDonald's, and attempted murder necessarily wasn't on there. And they talked about the fluid nature of charges kind of being applied. If charges were heightened in Arizona, would the extradition, would this kind of feud, maybe would Arizona be more in the right?
Potentially, yes. If the defendant is charged in Arizona with violent crimes, then Arizona would have a reason to hold the defendant accountable. I really don't understand this issue, because you're talking about murder. It's not like the case hasn't been charged in New York, for this type of political posturing. I would see if there was a concern if charges weren't filed, there wasn't an arrest warrant. But to the extent that an individual has committed crimes in Arizona, and those crimes were of a violent nature, then maybe, just maybe, there would be a reason to keep him in Arizona to face those charges first before he was extradited to New York.
All right, that makes sense. And I just want to ask you, because obviously you don't think that Arizona should do what they're doing. They should probably extradite back to New York. Does this kind of case, does this scenario happen often or at all?
Never, Andy. I got to tell you, in my more than 20 years of practice as a prosecutor, handling civil and criminal cases, I've never seen anything like this. Obviously, when it comes to different countries, this happens all the time, but not between states. We're the United States of America. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, I certainly a lot of people potentially echo those sentiments as well. Another question I have, obviously, we're talking about Arizona and New York, but this individual potentially also arrested in Florida as well for different charges as well. Now there's potentially a triangle of states. Is New York still potentially at the top? And maybe how does Florida fit into this conversation?
I think Florida would probably be third in line again. Depends on the nature of the charges, but there's nothing really worse than murder. And, what folks need to realize is there's politics, but there's also a case here. And cases tend to get worse over time. Evidence can disappear, witness memories fade. So if you're a prosecutor, you want to bring a murderer to justice as quickly as possible. Justice Knight is a victim. Her family obviously has a right to be heard as well. So to kick this case out months or even years because, Arizona or Florida want to handle less serious charges doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
All right, and my next question is, let's say this all goes through and potentially the Supreme Court takes it up and says that Arizona has to extradite to New York. How does that process happen, and maybe how quickly does Rod Al-Mansouri get to New York and potentially face these charges in a trial or whatnot?
Andy, it happens pretty quickly. So the way it works is, let's say the Supreme Court issues a writ or some sort of order compelling Arizona to release the defendant. Then New York officials will come and actually physically retrieve him from the state of Arizona. He'll probably be flown. Well, we actually had a recent case where doomsday cult mom, Lori Vallow, she was actually driven from Idaho to Arizona, of all places, to stand charges. So Arizona's been on the receiving end of receiving a murderer, so they should really be complying here.
Yeah, and I also want to ask you, because obviously there are multiple crimes committed in multiple states, and for Al-Mansouri in this potential trial taking place in New York, does the fact that he committed crimes in places like Florida, the fact that he's potentially facing crimes, even attempted murder in Arizona, does that maybe even heighten some of the sentencing for this individual?
It does. So, any convictions, to the extent that they're felonies or crimes of moral turpitude, they may come in actually at trial. Substantively, especially if the defendant testifies. But, if not, and the judge excludes all that and the jury doesn't hear about it, it's certainly a factor that judges will consider at sentencing. So most states, murder can be a 25 to life type case, and that would be something that would push the defendant up towards that life end of the sentencing range.
All right, Neama Rahmani, any parting words, anything I didn't get to? Because obviously, like you said, this is a kind of a once in a blue moon case that we rarely ever see. Anything you want to part on our audience before I let you go?
Andy, it's really sad as a former prosecutor to see the politicization of our criminal justice system. I understand people are upset at Donald Trump's treatment, his supporters, but we're talking about a murderer here. I mean, this is someone that, we really shouldn't be playing political football with a case like this. As a victim and her family, and they deserve justice. And it's really shameful what Mitchell, the Maricopa County attorney, is doing here.
All right, Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, friend of the program. Thanks again for your insight and perspective here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks for having me, Andy.